movements. We've got the LGBTQ community, we've got Black Lives Matter, we've got Asian Lives Matter. The list goes on. So if we get these groups in one place, they would never agree.
Being from the South, people are so set in they're set in their box. I think there is such a fear of that loss of power, and anything that's going to sort of undermine longstanding traditions or histories in the US.
Well, hello, Sarah, and welcome to Ph.D. Hard Talk. Thank you very much for your time today. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you? It's so lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Excellent. That's the way forward. So in terms of your research then, could you introduce your research to the wider audience?
Absolutely. So I am an art historian. So my focus is primarily on modern and contemporary photography and performance art. And I look specifically kind of at the African diaspora and also at Black Southern feminist artists who are creating performances in the South about kind of like the culture, the kind of issues that people in the South are still kind of facing in terms of neo-slavery. So I look at all those sorts of intersections. And I'm interested in performance as this sort of kind of ephemeral thing that happens once. And then all that's left behind is kind of this photographic evidence. And in doing this kind of study, I'm also from the South. So I'm interested too in the way the South has this very romantic view of its kind of foundings and histories. And so really trying to look to kind of break those foundations and disrupt that in a lot of ways by kind of prioritizing and privileging the voices of people who've been very much silenced and absent a lot. So I also am interested too in the intersections of kind of race and identity and how archives are incomplete, but how a lot of these kind of Black artists are really making work that creates a new archive and provides new perspectives that challenge these other ways of viewing and ways of seeing the world.
Excellent. So I'm going to ask this. I'm in the UK.
Yes.
What do you mean by South?
No, that's such a good question. Okay, yes. So in the United States, primarily people will probably have different views on what the South is, but most of us, if you can picture a map of the US from like below Virginia, right. So the state of Virginia down on the East Coast, and then as we move across, probably till about like Louisiana's in there, Alabama, it's kind of like that quarter of the US that's in the bottom, and we can include Florida down there. So that area, parts of Texas and like parts of like lower Illinois. So that section even is what the South would be. My terms of thinking, that's such a great question that I do actually take for granted that I am in the South. I teach in the South, so I don't always think about that. But my work too is primarily situated in Louisiana. For example, I do a lot of research there, and then also kind of in North Carolina. And then I do work too in Virginia, because that was kind of one of the main seats of the Confederacy, the president. Actually, the president of the Confederacy, his home is preserved in Richmond, Virginia, which is the capital. And it's actually right as you are trying to go to the hospital. It's like in the ER, the emergency room entrance. And there's his house. It's just, so I don't know what to do with that information, but it's there. So
sharing is caring. And sharing is power as well. So it will help someone out.
Yeah, it's right there. So, but yeah, so thinking primarily about the South as kind of that from Virginia down on the East Coast, and over a little bit.
Excellent. So in terms of arts then, and if we're looking at the South and we're looking at the Black artists, music through art, etc., what is your understanding and your viewpoint of previous history and current situation? How have they embraced their history, their past in a sense, and how are they then educating the newer generations through art?
That's such a great question. So there was actually, I'm going to go back in time for a minute. There was a great book actually by a British economics professor, Paul Gilroy, that he wrote in the 1990s called The Black Atlantic. And that was kind of one of the first books that really began to sort of challenge these dominant white narratives, right? And in art history in particular, art history is developed as a field by some white men in Germany. So that's where it stands. And it's just these old white dudes in Germany talking about their favorite artists. And those are also all a bunch of like white European men. And all non-Western art is kind of used as this sort of crutch, right? It's kind of used as like, it's kind of in there as just part of the story, or to make these great Western male geniuses look even better, right? Like, oh, Picasso looked at African masks, what an innovator. So I think at the current moment, a lot of artists, there's been a real turn, especially in art history, to kind of move away from the term art history because of its kind of connotations of this very sort of maybe a static field, or a field that's very much stuck in this past that doesn't include women, it doesn't include minorities. It thinks of all non-Western material culture as just like, oh, isn't that cute? Like it very much diminishes the importance of it. And so in the field, there's definitely a turn to something like visual culture, right? So understanding that every culture has its own sort of visual products, and they're all important. And I would say that, Paul Gilroy writes this book in 1994, and I think it really opened up the way that people began to see and think about Black art. And so he's talking about how the Atlantic Ocean is a space, right, that should be studied as much as we study like the South, right? Or like England, for example, that there was so much that happened within, these kind of these forced movements of people. And so I think what a lot of artists, what I say in my research are doing now is really kind of forcing the concept that the past very much shapes the present and the future. And so there's a huge disruption of linear time. And I think a really great move that I find really generative and interesting is that even though, of course, like thinking about slave records, all that remains of people who were forcibly enslaved may be, a notation in a ledger, of someone, a 13-year-old girl, or, someone whose name's been changed. And so thinking about these absences, and I think a lot of artists are doing this as well, is not that these absences mean there's nothing, right? It actually can be a space to remember, to create their own sort of Black archive. Also to really, I think a lot of artists especially are reframing a gaze, like reframing this perspective of how Black people are seen, how this Black history should be shared and understood. And so I think by taking the camera, right, there's so much inherent about, photography's kind of violent histories, even the terminology we use, right? Like the shutter, like you click and you point and there is this kind of violence in that. And the camera was used for so long as a way to sort of document or to show that non-Western people were lesser than, right? So these artists are taking this technology that is inherently kind of tried to lessen them and then really sort of reframing it. They're creating works of art that kind of force you into this relationship with them, and to understand this sort of history, this complicity. And I think a lot of artists today are making work that, forces you to have a response. It's meant to make you uncomfortable because it's meant to make you sort of challenge and really think about everything you've ever been told, and really sort of make that history present, and also that absence. But also I would say too that a lot of work I've been reading about lately, instead of focusing so much on oppression, there's also a celebration of life and joy and Black life, and this ability, to create these new forms of community that the slave trade really sought to completely destroy and disrupt. So those are a lot of the things I think I would say are happening now.
I understand what it is you're saying. Going back to, for example, Europe, as you there, and the male Caucasians who've written books, taken pictures, etc. And they've tried to educate all of us in terms of what it is to, for example, to be Black, or some of the beads that we wear, etc., and what they're linked to through ethnographic research and other means of of research. But then if we were to say, you know, okay, some of it was done just for their own, what's the word I'm looking for? Clout. You know,
Yeah.
that's the word now. And then we take, you know, the artists who come from different ethnic, you know, backgrounds as well. Could we say, based on your understanding and research, because this is your field, that some of them, they do it for clout, because, you know, there is a niche market there, and we want to know what our people went through. So therefore, there is possibility. Would you say that's still a thing that is happening?
You mean thinking about these images from, say, like the late 1800s as like a source of knowledge or interest, or
being exploited to basically brand myself so I can make more money as an ethnic minority? Is it a possibility, is what I'm asking?
I think that is such a good question. And to be honest, not something I have thought about in those terms, right? About this use of money. There's an interesting, well, it's kind of sort of over, not really. In thinking about some of these images, there was a professor at Harvard, his name was Louis Agassiz, and he had these, it was 15 enslaved people in South Carolina. Their portraits taken, ethnographic portraits in the 1850s, because he wanted to use them for study, right? Of course. And so one of the most famous ones, it's of a man named Renty. If I pulled it up, you would probably be familiar with it in some way. You probably have seen it. It's very kind of ubiquitous. It's used in a lot of like promotional things. He's not always named, but there was a court case that happened in the pandemic. So it kind of got a little crazy, but there was a woman, a family, the Lanier family, and they said, that's our great grandfather or great great grandfather. And they had stories of him. They knew, like, you know, they always talked about like Papa Renty, all of these things. And so they actually filed a court case against Harvard. And it brought up this whole kind of thing of like, who owns these images of enslaved people, right? And actually the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled in Harvard's favor and said that they owned the photographs because they couldn't trace this genealogy properly to their sort of thing. So, but now Harvard is still profiting off the image. If I remember, there was this, you know, sort of compromise they thought they had made where they could sell the image for like $13 a use. And I think it's, maybe I'm not totally answering the question properly. I think it's such a complicated process. I think too, that so many of these images, like especially this collection, the Zeely photographs, or as they're called, belong to Harvard's, right? And so even trying to get them back. And so the Lanier family said too, they just wanted the acknowledgement as well that this was a person, right? And that Harvard's ruling is kind of like a continuation of sort of enslaving this man's image, right? And using it for profit without his consent. And so I think that also kind of throws a wrench in things in some ways, because a lot of these images are owned by these major institutions, right? So I think it's so complicated and complex. And then you get, you know, the courts are involved in these, you know, and they, you know, Harvard, I think, wow, look at me bashing Harvard. But anyways, they said that, you know, they would charge a little bit for people to use it, but that doesn't solve that problem, does it? You know, especially if the money's not going to the Lanier family or to make any type of restitution. It's just yeah.
I think it's a tricky thing. I mean, I'm going to sound a bit insensitive in the sense
No,
of we can't trace it back to say that is the actual family.
Right.
They could be trying to get into the media to start their own brands as well, you know, with clouting. Hence why I use the word clout, because clout is such a thing now. You don't know the real from the reality.
No, it really is it's very true. Clout is such a good word to use, right? Yeah. Because and then, you know, I was actually, I bring up this kind of court case because I was writing about, because one of the other kind of famous images from this grouping is actually the main man Renty, his daughter Delia. And I'm like, okay, one of the things, of course, I'm thinking about is like, well, everybody's upset with Renty, but why not Delia, right? Like, why not her? What is her image is just as kind of like powerful. And, what was it about this, the court case, or the New York Times who wrote the article? Like, why was there such a focus on the image of Renty and not of the woman, right? So Delia, so I think I think what you're saying is perfect. It's so complicated. I think it's so multi-layered, and it's hard to know intentions, right? Intentionality for people in doing things. So yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's
perception is a killer, basically.
Yeah.
Because if you look at, I think there's an image of a woman who moved from South Africa, and she was sold the dream. She didn't leave through slavery, but she had a really big bottom.
Oh, Sarah Bartman. Yes. I'm sorry, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, you basically, so that's all I was going to say, is there's a fine line. Someone might say, do you know what, that's my relative, and then it's like, how do you trace it?
And that is, and I think it's also I think that brings up too, like, conversations of like such privilege, right, of being able to trace your ancestors. And again too, like, I always think of this concept of like, I can trace my ancestors back to, I don't know, someone in my family did, like, Scotland in like the 1600s or something, right? But the, slave trade or non-Western cultures, that's virtually non-existent. So who is, again, it's like using these concepts of a Western idea of what family looks like and what community looks like and what kinship and family, right? Like this nuclear family idea is very sort of prescribed in the West. And I think that Sarah Bartman is a great example too, because there's so much about her image that it's like, some scholars say that she had a hand in the creation of those advertisements, but like, could she? Like, that power dynamic, it's the 1800s, she's a South African woman. I mean, it's like, I feel like I'm just, it's just it's such a, oh my God, so I think there's like, it's so complex. And yeah, I've been teaching a seminar this semester on kind of like African arts. We've been talking a lot about bodies and representation and stereotypes. And we keep coming back actually to kind of Sarah Bartman, or in the US, Sally Hemings, who was Thomas Jefferson's, actually his sister-in-law, but also his she was enslaved, but they had 5 children together. And all these movies and books want to romanticize that. She was 14, he was 40. That's all I'm gonna, like, that's an unequal power relationship. And the museum on the Jefferson plantation has chosen to tell her story through the words of her son, but also without depicting her. There's no representations of her. Like, they have like a bust form, a dress form with clothing, but no face. And so I think that is maybe one solution, but still problem. Like, there's still so many. It's just constantly this, like, I feel like I wish this was like a word, that this gesture had a word, because it's, again, we have to think, I think these unequal power relationships are very present. And then also the lack of that genealogical evidence, which people, like, institutional spaces love, right? They need that. You want the evidence of something. So.
And the other thing, I guess, if not to sound selfish, you and I wouldn't be doing our PhDs or going into academia if these things were there. I'm just saying.
Exactly. I mean, no, exactly. Like, it's like, if it was there,
have a job.
What would we do? Like, if these things get solved, if there are answers to these questions, I would love that. But it's like, I don't know what I would do. What would I do now? Like, who would teach the class that I came up with? It's like, so it's just this very, yeah, it's a lot to think about, and there's no good answers. And I agree, like, you feel selfish, or it feels weird to say it, like, well, I don't know if I want the answers, because I want to have a job, and so it becomes this, it's, yeah. This is the PhD hard talk right here, like, that's it.
I can't pronounce. Allow me to have a job. That's it.
Yes.
But no, exactly. Back to your research then. In terms of I mean, we've talked about society back and current. There isn't much that has changed, hence why we have the feminist theories. So in terms of your work then, in your opinion, the top 3 theories that would, in a way, have an umbrella over the topics that we've touched on in the past 10 minutes or 15 minutes?
Okay. Oh my gosh. Okay. I feel like I've been preparing for this question my whole life, and now it's here, and I'm like,
you can't use the
okay.
psychological theory, the feminist theory, no, because that's obvious.
That's obvious. That's so obvious. I would say one thing that I would say is neo-slavery, neo-colonial. I don't know, like, I guess that would fall into like post-colonial theory, but I would say like neo-colonial theory is one of the things, because neo-slavery, I think we're in, especially like we're just in new forms of it, right? People want to say that it's gone. You know, and I think living in the US in the wake of Donald Trump and living in the South is a very scary sort of space where that is very alive and well, and a reminder that we are not past, especially like from a US perspective, we are not past anything that people may have thought we were like 10 years ago. So I would say that in some ways, and I mean, critical race theory, I think is so important. And I am fighting for this because right before break, there's states that are trying to make it illegal to discuss critical race theory in schools. I don't know if y'all have heard, if this has reached you all. Okay, so there are, I believe Alabama has passed a law that making critical race theory illegal. So technically, and I teach in Georgia, and I think Georgia's legislature is trying to kind of slip some language into a current bill to make it illegal. So essentially, as an instructor of like African art or African American art history, I can say to you as a student, slavery happened. This is how it all occurred, but I cannot say that it is still a problem or still a problem that is a part of an inherent structural issues in the United States. I can actually be, if I understand, I could be, if a student didn't like what I was saying, I could be turned in, potentially arrested or fined for discussing it.
That is not peculiar. It isn't interesting. It just shows that we haven't moved.
I know we haven't moved. And I, when I started hearing about this, friends of mine and I were like, this can't be, a thing. And like, I would get messages on like my Twitter or my Instagram, like, cause I repost like critical race theory, things, or, and people were saying that I was like a critical hate theorist or like, and I'm like, you don't understand at all. So I find this, I can't, like, critical race theory, it's coming back to this. I think it's so important. And I think I'm inserting it here because it's like this, it's under fire in the US. Like it is, people don't want to talk about it. They think that it is, it's similar to things where folks are like, oh, well, it's racist against white people. That's one of the arguments, which is like, should I pull out my white privilege checklist for you all to check out or, not? So I think maybe I would tie the neo-colonial with the critical race theory just because it's so important to understand, right, that the US is founded on racial capitalism, right? And I think that's one of the main things. Okay, so that was my critical race theory rant, which I didn't expect to get to so soon. So some other theories. I don't know necessarily if this is a theory, but it's kind of this theme that I've been reading about in a lot of work that's kind of coming up. One of them, an incredible scholar whose name is Tina Campt. She just published a book called The Black Gaze. And so it's all about sort of reframing the way that we see things and the way that Black artists are challenging the camera lens and the frame and that perspective, right? So I think creating new modes of seeing and thinking, and so I think the Black gaze also really ties in nicely to the concept Cydia Hartman put forward called wake work. So this idea that like, how can we sort of privilege these voices? What can we do for Black life that is kind of constantly living with this imminent threat of death, right? And so she talks about the wake work. She's such a beautiful writer that I read her work and I'm so glad she's doing it, but it's like, oh my, where does this come from? It's just life-changing. But her book in the wake on Blackness and being, she really goes into this concept that we're all in the wake, right? And in the wake of the slave ship, in the wake of like racial violence, and how can we do work within these sort of structures that really begins to challenge the fact that we still live within these spaces. They haven't gone away, they just look different, right? So I would kind of group those two together.
You know, in terms of the book, as you've just explained there, would you say that having a movement, for example, when it comes to slavery and a certain ethnic group, it boxes them up even more and it makes it hard for society to embrace them based on research? This is not based on experience, and you read throughout history. Would you say it's such a great thing to do, or is it better to educate the wider community rather than having a movement per se for one group?
That is a great question. I think that that's an incredible thing to think about, and kind of is touches on concepts that go with like ethnic studies as a concept, right? When you're only learning about one group, and is that limiting? So yeah, I think it has the potential to sort of box in, right? And not really show kind of how widespread. So I think yes, I think to answer your question, I would agree that it can have that potential to sort of box in a group of people.
So just to add on to that, so would you say in terms of that movement, it's promoting equality and diversity, or it's pushing positive, colonialistic, systematic approaches from a negative but yet positive mode of transport?
I think that if done, read, and taught, or investigated correctly, it has the first effect, right? That it can be an educational tool. But I think perhaps if it's a limited engagement, right, or like if it's kind of if it is only taught within a small space, right, or in connection to just one particular group, it can have that like neo-colonialist approach, right? That I loved how, what was it, that it's like negative positive, like kind of reification of these same systems. And I think that is a downfall, and something that as a scholar in a field of Black studies, you always have to be, or any sort of non-Western studies, to think about those issues and the way that can easily happen. So I feel like it can go either way, right? I think it can be good, it can be generative. But I also think too that you have to have an audience, especially here, like teaching, because I teach, like I said, I teach in Georgia, but I've also taught in Chicago, for example. It's also about, and this becomes, of course, a social issue, is about the mindset and the openness of and willingness of people and students to entertain these concepts, right? And so they can read into them. I think students could also take it to be boxing in, or they could take it as like, oh, I'm going to apply this to what I already know and how I've already experienced life, or maybe I didn't know these sorts of things. So I think there perhaps are a lot of factors that go into it. Again, it's like kind of bringing us back to this whole little gesture.
Okay, so if we look at this gesture and we call it an oxymoron, right?
Yeah.
And we then look at how the critical race theory is being imposed, do you see how that may link into the book and the educational piece not being shared from a wider community perspective and being narrowed down to a certain group, and how the other groups may then feel like we need to protect ourselves and therefore we have power, we know that we do, and we have the votes. So why don't we put certain words to ensure that, you know, within the community, both groups aren't fighting against each other, but we say that shouldn't be a thing, and therefore manage the balance from a strategic perspective. Because if you forecast future with the movements that are happening, for example, we've got, again, not to come across as limiting or saying this group is in a certain way, we've got movements, we've got the LGBTQ community, we've got Black Lives Matter, we've got Asian Lives Matter, we've got the whole greenhouse emissions, etc. Lives Matter, and then we've got the animal rights, and then we've got basically fashion, sustainability. The list goes on. I don't know why I'm going that way, but you know, the list, the list goes on. So if we get these groups in one place, they would never agree because they feel like the group is doing such and such, and therefore you get a lot of clashes. To balance, let's say, in terms of, okay, we were the group, you know, in terms of directors, we were set. Don't you think we would sit down and say, actually, let's go for the critical race theory, pass the bill. Okay, we'll look at the South. Okay, Georgia, for example, this is the majority. So let's pass it there because we know that conflict will arise. We need to maintain peace because we need employment. We need the GDP to grow. We're looking at 2025. Currently, it's quite low. So strategically, right, we need to do A, B, C, D because we need the students that are in, I don't know if you have sixth form, that are going to university to go on to university because they need to work, they'll borrow money for their education, and we need to keep them in the system. Would you agree, or do you disagree?
I think it's such a, you know, thinking about it from that perspective, when you break it down into like a strategic sort of, you know, we need to do this, 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 and this, and especially in these spaces, I can see how it is a strategic move, perhaps, to pacify groups of people. I just think it takes us backwards, right? Being from the South, people are so set in they're set in their box, right? If we're talking about people existing in these sort of particular frameworks, right? They're so set in them that they don't want to hear anything or learn anything outside of that box, right? If it's not their, you know, prescribed space, like if it's not the NRA, I don't want to hear about it, right? And I think, you know, I can see how maybe perhaps in legislature, it has this very strategic move, but I also think that there are so many people that are just so stuck in like that anything that can challenge any aspect of comfort, stability, power, rather than taking it as like a learning tool. And of course, what I'm saying is this very sort of utopian ideology. You know, I'm saying I wish everybody would kind of move themselves out of their prescribed box that they're into it and see all these viewpoints. And I was saying, I know that's very utopian of me and hopeful, but I think there is such a fear of that loss of power and anything that's going to sort of undermine, you know, longstanding traditions or histories in the US in particular, other spaces as well. But it you know, they're going to do anything they can to preserve that sort of power, supremacy, all those sorts of different things.
And I guess the other thing is, if we were to move it away from history, but we still link to history. How many women presidents are there in the world right now? Maybe that's too general. Can you name it? It's one country that's got a female president currently.
New Zealand.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I was reading that in Sweden, there was a female president for like 2.5 hours. And then the government, like the whole thing collapsed. Just, you know, it's just I'm sorry. And then I'm like, Kamala Harris was president for 85 minutes while Joe Biden had a colonoscopy. So that happened earlier this week. So there's that.
But essentially, what I'm trying to highlight to you is that we haven't moved that far from history. We may be 100 years later or 2,000 years later, but we're still before Christ. When it comes to reality, you know,
easy. Like we're maybe inching. We might be getting closer to like, you know, Caesar. maybe. We're not even to like the Roman Republic of all the, no, we're not, we haven't made it that far yet. No, God, no. They still want, you know, women in the back of the house. You're either a Vestal virgin or you're at home, you know. That's that. I completely agree with you. We have, and I think maybe that was my long-winded rant of way of saying, like, we haven't really made many strides at all, I would say.
And hence why, you know, with PhD Hard Talk, it's for the community. Because we write as researchers, we spend years, you know, and years like writing, but it's for other academics to then improve it. But the reality is the people at home, they're the ones who need it more. I mean, you can go on the internet and research, but it's always nice to click a button and you can hear it, you know, in terms of, okay, so you came up with this concept and this is your aim, right? I can see what you're saying and you've told me which books to read. So at least the community is being educated at a quicker pace. Because if history and reality, really, we haven't departed from history, have we?
No, not at all. No, I mean, it hasn't changed. You know, it may look different. And I think that's why the phrase like neo-colonial, or, you know, we haven't really made that many moves in terms of those sorts of things. Yeah. I think that's a great point. Yeah.
But these are our opinions, by the way, based on research and putting things together between you and I. It's just these are our opinions. So, you know, you go and do your research by yourself and keep it to yourself. Back to your research then. In terms of your methodological approach, I have to say it that way. I can.
It's a tough.
You know, what are your choices and why?
Oh, great question. So art history is so interesting. I also feel like I'm here to be like, art history is not scary. I have so many students, like freshmen, and they're like, well, I don't know anything about art. And I'm like, well, you don't have to, right? It's also like, you look at it, you experience it, you have an opinion. Like this semester, I've been making students write. I know they kind of hate it, but I think some of them have gotten into it, like choose one work of art each week and almost write like a letter to it, like a love letter, right? Just like have like a response to it. You can hate it, you can love it. Art history is not supposed to be scary. So I want to say that, hi everyone in the world, don't be afraid to go to a museum, and you can love it, you can hate it, it's all totally fine. But some of the methodologies in art history are very interdisciplinary. I pull from all different sorts of things. So of course, like the first thing I always do is looking, right? Very close looking and thinking about what do I see? And that kind of will become then the basis. So I think a lot of people use images to illustrate their points. And I am on the other side of like, I want the images and the work to do that talking. So I don't say like looking at images to be sort of like patronizing or dismissive. I want the work and what the artist is trying to say or do to kind of lead how I do my research. So a lot of times, so for my dissertation, each chapter is on a different performance piece by a different artist. And one of the things that kind of happened is I would see the image, a photograph of that moment, and then I would look at all of them before I read anything, right? So it was just really sitting and looking and seeing like, what am I taking from this? What do I see this work doing? And then kind of engaging with what the artist said about their own research. So I really like to let the work lead my research. So that's one of my first sort of methodological kind of points. And then I think too, just I had a professor once tell me that I wrote too much like a journalist, that I wasn't like academic enough. And I think that comes from wanting to make it accessible, right? Like not wanting to put all of the, you know, teleological ontologies and, you know, all of that sort of stuff. So I think also methodological approaches, you know, really doing, also engaging with a lot of historical research, really thinking too and privileging people's experiences and other people's voices. So I look at a lot of like reenactments as well. So what does that do? What does that tell us? And so a lot of history, also a lot of like visits to spaces to actually kind of get a sense of the actual place itself, which is fortunate because I mean, Louisiana, New Orleans, beignets, you know, you could pick a worse place to do some research, right? So actually being in a space and getting that sense. So I think it's looking, it's experiencing, it's thinking, and then I typically turn to research, because I don't want to have that sort of confirmation bias of like, I'm going looking for something in particular. So also, like I mentioned Tina Camp's book, The Black Gaze. I just read that. And then that sort of really gave me all of these ideas, and I started to kind of maybe rethink a couple of things that I'd already written. So doing that, and I think those are some of my major, just sort of like basic methodological approaches to different things.
No, that's quite interesting. I mean, to go off topic, I had,
Yeah.
you know, there is a trap house museum.
Yes.
That was fascinating.
Oh yeah.
Like, I'm like, if that's a thing, I was like, I need to go there.
Yeah, yes, there's so many, and I keep finding out about all these museums, and I'm like, well, I have to go there now too. You know, the other day I just like, I was reading about some like a new museum, or maybe it was like a new exhibition on like it was around Halloween, like so on like witches, and like I call my advisor and I'm like, witches, and she's like, finish your first project, just finish one, okay? Like you cannot. Yeah, she's like, can you just like do the one, and then you can think about the next one. I know you just want to go see the show, but like, no, there's so many different things. And I think also that's something else I would say I consider in my research, is how is it presented to us in particular, especially in terms of photography, and I mean, and just everything, right? Because photographs, and even going back to like our earlier conversation, like photography is very edited, right? You see it in a very particular way. It's, you know, people have always thought there were these, you know, inherent truth claims because it documents and it expands vision in a way that we ourselves we're not aware of, right? That there are things that the camera captures that we don't see, but that photographer had an aim, had a goal. That image, I mean, even when you take an image on your cell phone, right? Like, I mean, I know I've taken like 80 selfies in a row to get the right one. So it becomes this thing of thinking about being critical of the way that who's presenting this information, how are they doing it, and what has been sort of kind of cropped or changed. And so always having that, I think, in the back of your mind. And even with artists, even with these, you know, I don't want these amazing women, these amazing projects that I do research on, they are very much cropping them to get a specific message across. So I think always thinking about that is super important as well.
So I agree with you. So going back to clout, do you agree that clout is a thing?
Oh, 100%. Yes. Like all day, every day. Like clout is, I mean, you know, and that also brings up, I mean, you can tell I'm at the end of the semester thinking about all these art historical things, because, you know, I did a lecture on like trying to kind of like ruining the myth of the male genius, right? Artist. So that sense of clout, but also to these particular people, like who says like clout, like it's, who says who gets to be in a museum, right? Who says that something is important enough to be saved, right? And it's people with clout, right? It's the people that say like, oh, this is worth it, right? This goes in this space, or I'm going to deem this worthy of study or research or preservation. So clout is, I mean, all the way, all day, every day. Yeah.
And you know, you've just reminded me of the author, is it Hare? Mr. Hare, he's been on TED Talks and he talks about reality and animals and
yes,
you know, the way we perceive things. I forgot his first name, but I know his last name is Haare.
Yes, I know who you're talking about. Yeah. Yes.
Have you watched his TED Talks when he explains reality? Who says that $5 is the trading currency and that is actually worth $5 US when it's just a paper?
Exactly. And we all agree with it, right?
Yeah.
Like we've
no
all
one's ever challenged it.
No one's ever challenged, you know, and I think back because now you've talked about money, I'm going to, so I've never understood math, right? I'm an art historian. I like to look at things. I'm not trying to figure out value. And when I was in first grade, so like when I was about 6 and they were teaching us subtraction, I cried in class because I didn't understand where the numbers had gone, right? Like who took them away? And it's the same to me with like, we all agree that $5 is $5, but is it like we've all agreed that there are 365 days a year? Are there? Like, I mean, could there be more? Could there be less? I mean, we're all still doing this daylight savings time business. I mean, there's so many. I think that is like, reality always. I think too, like just this semester too with students, and even kind of coming out of like teaching in COVID, in the pandemic, of like, just think about your reality question, like, really when you have time. I think too, teaching on Zoom, we would always talk about like time and this sort of, we're Zooming now where it's like we're in each other's reality space, but in a virtual way. Like, what does this mean? All of these things. So just really thinking about that sort of thing. But yeah, no, I'll have to look up those TED Talks, because yeah, who says $5 is $5? We just agree that it is. And that's where we go. Yeah. What is it?
It's groupthink, isn't it? It's groupthink creates reality. Hence why I was saying about clout and saying, we've got all these movements. Who is genuine and who isn't? But when you're in a group, you have power. And with power, you can change things in terms of what reality is and what perception people should see. With the movement, for example, within research, you have your hypothesis and your objectives, and it's the same as you said with the lens. You have your hypothesis, objectives, and and you take the picture. Whether you're facing that way, the camera is facing the right direction.
Exactly.
What people see, because that's what you want them to see. So is reality TV actual reality? Who knows?
It's constructed for you. I don't know, but I think that yes, it's the people with it's the people with power. Always has been, right? Like always is. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm having like some revelation. It's so true though. Yeah. What is reality?
And what is perception?
And because that's we don't stop and think about, right? Because we just experience them, right? We just, we're in it. We're in our own reality, whatever that looks like. Yes.
But anyway, so to move on now in terms of the challenges that one faces in research. So as a woman, could you take me through, your understanding of the challenges that are in academia?
I'm like, where do we begin? I will say that art history is a very female-dominated field. Like I said, it didn't start out that way because it was a lot of men. It currently is very female-driven. So that is a space. I'm fortunate to be in a space where there are a lot of women doing things. But I would say that I've had an interesting experience, and again, my reality and perspective. So I was in Chicago teaching at UIUC, or outside of Chicago. And I always felt kind of, like well respected by students. I always had a very positive experience. And then now I'm in the South, and I have faced more misogyny as an instructor, and people not taking me seriously or going to a male colleague over, even though it's my class. And I think that's something I wasn't necessarily prepared for. Again, one of these things I thought, like, there's plenty of female professors. I thought we had moved past this, but we haven't. So I think that is an issue. A lot of male students, for example, I have a student who hasn't been to class all semester, never shown up to class ever once. Week 14, never come to class. And he came to my office and basically just was like, please, 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 please. And I felt that it was very much like, oh, I'll give you this, like, please, because you're a woman, and that will, okay, great, cool. Okay, you'll pass me for the class. So that's one area I think going into teaching that I have experienced is that type of misogyny. And then as a researcher, I haven't had that many bad experiences in terms of doing actual research for things. I think because I also I do a lot of research on women. So I think there is this kind of communal sense that happens within that space. But I've definitely, it's like, especially also, even though art history is this female dominated field, outside of kind of the academic, like the White Castle, people think it's cute, that you do, like, what are you going to do with that? people, I've actually, had people say like, oh, so what, you just look at pictures? That must be fun. Yeah. And so there's a real sort of like lessening of, or dismissiveness of the work or the research, or, she may not know anything. She doesn't know anything. She just looks at things. Right. So I think those are some of the challenges I've had recently. I think too, the research, especially since the pandemic, a lot of it's been done online. It's been so stalled, like that actually going to the physical space has been challenged and different. So I haven't, when you're just like popping into the archives of, the New York Library, nobody's stopping you there. But I think that I've experienced these things of very much of a dismissiveness and a lot of like kind of misogynistic responses to my authority, my, like what I know, like the labor that I put into things, or even like what I'm trying to teach. I've dealt with a lot.
So going back to the South and the culture there, based on my understanding, it's male dominated, it's a masculine environment. Would you say that's the biggest challenge that you have, in the sense of, we say it's a masculine environment, but it's actually cultural as well?
Yes, 150%. Yes, it's cultural, men, I think also I grew up in the South, so a lot of things I didn't realize necessarily, like men just calling you like sweetheart or darling or honey. And then, you go to spaces and people are like, no one should say that. That's not always like, okay, if it's not someone that and it's very male dominated. I mean, even in meetings, it's a male voice that gets privileged over a woman, and women's work is not taken as seriously as men, I would say. And I think, that permeates down to all kind of levels of things, right? Like that male students will go to a male colleague, or they think they can come to me and just say like, oh, I'm sorry. And that I'll just, erase all those zeros, or they challenge, like, I had a student last semester who I pronounced a word in French, not great by any means, but like, I know art history, I know a little French. And he raised his hand, and I thought there was going to be a question. And he said that I pronounced French pretty well for a woman.
Okay.
And so I would say that it permeates the culture. It is the culture in the South, specifically, just because that's where I am. So that's where I'm kind of thinking about a lot of these things at the moment. So yeah, very male dominated.
Okay, so now to ask, in terms of Sarah as a person, strategically, you've been in this environment now where you are challenged, and whereby if you do state something, someone else will then hype up, because the male, everybody claps their hands. Strategically, to ensure that your voice is heard, what measures have you put in place so that you can push and get the objectives out there when it comes to whatever you're trying to narrate to the audience? What strategies have you put in place?
Yes, that's a great question. So my first instinct, of course, is to is the one that I push down, which is to be like, please sit down and be quiet and be respectful, like that's and say things that you shouldn't say in a classroom. But some of the things I've said are, when asking, so there was a lot of like interrupting, right? There was the feeling that they could just say whatever they wanted when they could. And so then it was like, I would, be interrupted, and I would say, could you please wait till I finish speaking, or please raise your hand and I'll call on you. So trying that kind of like firm, which makes me then feel like a mom, right? Where I'm like, please stop, sit down, raise your hand. That's one. So I have said before too, when things have come up like that, like, oh, you pronounce that very good for a woman. I've asked, would it make a difference if I was a man? Why does it matter, my French pronunciation? So I have pushed, I'm always waiting to get in trouble, because I have pushed back a little bit, because I'm like, why are you saying that? And I think, so I've pushed back in those terms. I've also, said, please don't do that. That's not respectful. I've also, in some cases, if it's something that it's like it happened and then we'll move on, I will ask to speak to someone after class and just kind of talk about why that's not appropriate. Most of the time I have had, most people have been respectful and said like, oh, I apologize, I didn't realize, or something like that. So trying to put those measures in place. Also remembering, even though I feel like I'm like 12 in a classroom, remembering that like this is my space, this is my place, this is my sort of knowledge that I'm sharing with you. And like I do want my classroom to be a conversation, but I also don't have a problem if someone interrupts me to say I pronounce something well, to push back, right? Like, why are you saying this? Why did you feel the need to say that? And try to do that in a respectful way, but also again, try to get them, why'd you ask me that? Like, that has no bearing on this. So put in some like measures of being a little stern, but then also trying to get people to think about where the impetus for that came from. Why did you add "for a woman" on the end of that statement?
Moving on from that, so you're within an institute. What is the appetite amongst your male colleagues, and what measures have you put in place? Okay.
I would say I actually feel super fortunate. My male colleagues are incredibly supportive. The ones that I work closely with, I will say, like, I feel very fortunate. They've always been really great. We have had, issues of like, male students being inappropriate with instructors or sending, kind of inappropriate emails. And they've always been the first to be like, send that to me, I will take care of that. And so I feel male colleagues are respectful and have been very, very supportive and kind. So I will give them all the props for that. They listen, they want to know, if, you're meeting with someone and you have your door open and they hear something sounds maybe like it's a little off, they may come in and just check. So I feel very lucky to be in a space where the men are very supportive of their female colleagues.
Okay. So going back to, inappropriate emails.
Yeah.
You say there's a spirit of confusion in the sense of there's a spirit of I can sleep my way up and say inappropriate things, or I can push the button and flirt a little bit. I want the cougar, or, I don't know how you say it, but, that kind of confusion.
Yes. I feel like you are being so much nicer to them. Maybe I should be like, I think they do it on total purpose. I think these, like a football player at a US college, like American football, he knows exactly what he is doing, right? Like there is this, I will bat my eyes. I am the quarterback and I'm here. I'm going to say that, she looked really nice today, or she has a great smile. Like, and that's going to get me the passing grade that I need.
Wouldn't you say that's the spirit of confusion? Because you are being delusional. You've signed a contract. You don't know if you're going to break your legs. You're not going to be on top.
Yeah.
You're going to be broke at some point, or you might make it, but no one will want you because of your behaviors and conduct. So therefore, spirit of confusion.
Yeah. And I think I like spirit of delusion too, right? It's this spirit of delusional. So yes, they are operating within that. And I'm sure that in other spaces in high school or things like that, they got away with it. It worked, right? And then, you get to other spaces where it's like, no. So spirit of delusion, confusion. Yes, for sure. For sure. Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of advice then for someone who's from a similar space like the South, who's thinking, right, I've finished my PhD, I've done my postdoc, and I've been offered a job, but I've been on the internet and I've seen that, there's a culture, as we've said, the spirit of delusion and the spirit of confusion for both males and females. Yeah. And I have tendencies of being loose with my mouth, albeit my body, right?
Yes.
What can I put in place to ensure that I don't fall into the pit whereby I entertain those behaviors? or I cast them out and lose my job?
Yeah, I think this is a great question because this is a space where, like you want to be relatable. So you want to be open to students. I think that it comes to from a place of, the first time it happened to me, I didn't address it immediately in class. I kind of just, I can't remember the first time. It may have been the French comment. And then that student interrupted me a couple of other times. And I think I just kind of said, hi, like, I really appreciate your comments, but I do ask that you just sort of like, wait, please raise your hand and wait to be called on. And so then I had a lot of conversations with friends of mine about how do we handle this sort of thing. And I think it comes into a place of it's a fine line about it's a fine line to walk, but I think the best thing to do is actually to start off if you're into teaching, start off your semester kind of being a bit of a hard ass, kind of not hard, but just, really, really putting down those rules, making rules not only for yourself. And this is something I have to work on as well, like make space, like I am only available at these particular times, right? Because we're so connected on our phones. I'm not going to answer your email at like midnight or things like that. So put those barriers into place. And I think making a very strict sort of code of conduct of like, please raise your hand and wait to be called on. Please don't interrupt your classmates. And if that does happen, calling that out when it does, right? I don't think it has to be rude. I think it can be, just like, I see that you have something to say, but so-and-so also raised their hand first. I think trying to implement those things to have more classroom control is something that is important. I also think too, something I've done is again, like when I have been interrupted, it'll be like, I see you have something to say. Could you please wait until I finished speaking? And so trying to create those levels of respect, but also still being like, I do want to hear what you have to say. I also think too, there's, when someone says something in class that might be off the rails or a bit offensive, I have found, saying like, I see where you're coming from, but then trying to reframe it as like a question, or have you thought about it in this particular way? And then, so those are some things I've put in place, but there are times that, the way that I'm trying to like protect myself in the classroom space or in my office hours, or even in my email, which is with you all the time on our phones. It doesn't always work, right? And so sometimes it has to be very, very firm, or just even saying like, I don't appreciate this behavior, or this semester in particular, I had to get to a point with some students and say, this is very disrespectful to me and to your classmates. And so sometimes you do feel like, okay, I'm teaching college. It feels like I'm a nanny again, but those are some of the things I think I would. And I think every classroom and every space is different, but I think doing what feels comfortable for you, but also just making sure that you foreground that level of respect, right? For not only yourself, but for the rest of the students in your classes is important. And calling it out when it happens. Like you can do that even in your mind, if you are saying like, expletive after expletive, finding a way to do that very tactfully, and try to turn it into a teaching moment, right? Without getting fired. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
in terms of mental health then, because, when you are in a rather challenging environment and when the culture itself isn't built for your gender, or maybe your beliefs or culture or religion, it can be quite tough for your mental health. So what advice would you give somebody looking at yourself in your current scenario, whereby you're being challenged, for example, by somebody that you might see as a young brother, but because they have potential to earn 430,000 a month, for example,
Yeah.
they then don't have that line of respect, but you have to continue to build boundaries. You're constantly having to enforce and challenge. You get exhausted at some point. What advice do you have?
I think something that I have learned that's super helpful is to actually take time where you separate yourself from your phone. Like there has to be time where you turn it off, or, you know, like do not check your email after a certain point. I know that seems like a very, you know, it's like a reflex. You pick up your phone and that's one of the things you do. But I would say that is important for mental health, because sometimes it's those students or those people who will email you at like 9:30 or 10 o'clock, right? And again, that is crossing that boundary again, right? When you've said like, I may not, you know, in my teaching policies, I say, you know, if you email me after 5, you can expect a delayed response, right? And then so responding to them or reading them, that email then is going to perhaps mess up your sleep or cause you additional stress, that it's like to so separate yourself in that way, I think is a good boundary. I am also all about therapy and talking to someone who's a professional. I think that's really important, and also kind of, is something I've done for a very long time, just to help with anxiety, give good coping skills for things like that. So I'm always an advocate of mental health in that way. But another thing I learned too, and I keep mentioning COVID, but it was a really sort of like, for me, and I know for everybody, a very sort of pivotal moment. I had just broken up with a partner. I was living by myself for most of it. And I think I learned in that space too, that something I remember, like, even though I love my work, I love my research, right? But it doesn't, that's not all I am. So I think, and I think in graduate school, I think doing research, I'm sure where you feel like that, it's so connected to you. It follows you around, right? It's like
Like a
you're
baby,
tethered.
isn't it?
Yeah, it's like a baby that like it always needs something,
Yeah.
right? It's like a never happy, it's like a constantly unhappy baby, right? And so I think too, learning to create and carve out time that to do things for myself, that wasn't research related, is really important for mental health. Like my friends and I, we try to like have like, even because we're all over the place, like FaceTime happy hours or Zoom happy hours, or just do things, or even just watch a mindless movie. Or sometimes I love to read a terrible, trashy novel to remind myself I like to read for me, you know,
For fun.
and walk. Yes. And taking a walk. I love taking walks, and I love to cook too. So these are things I find that it's like, take yourself out of that research space and give yourself time to be you. And I think that for anybody, we're more than our jobs. They live with us because of computers and all of this tech stuff. But I think those are some of my advice things. And also, like, you know, go to Sephora, buy the face mask. It's going to be good for you, I think, is also important, you know, like eat the ice cream. So just do something nice for yourself, right? Like you were your own sort of best friend. So I think those are some of my advice things for mental health.
Excellent. I mean, there's a lot there, and I
Yeah.
hope it does benefit somebody. The final question, you'd be glad to hear, is why did you come on PhD Hard Talk?
Such a great question. I think I have watched the work you all have done, and I think it's so beneficial. It's so wonderful too that you've created a space where these questions can be discussed, right? And these issues can be sort of talked about, and there's a safe space, and you're building this amazing sort of community for researchers and academics to come together and talk about the hard things or the things we're not sure about, right? And make it safe. But also, I think, as you mentioned earlier, it allows for the general public to sort of come into a space, see what it's like sort of behind, like lift sort of the gilded curtain, right? Or move that ivory tower out of the way so that you can see like we are doing work that we want to be important and mainstream and to reach you in a particular way. So I think I felt so honored to be asked to be part of this, to have this conversation with you, because what y'all are doing, I think, is so important for so many levels of society, for people. It's just such a great thing.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, it is really touching, the fact that you got that, so amazing. But thank you so much, Sarah, for your time. Remember, project dissemination to the world. Let's share our knowledge and reach the wider community. So thank you again, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Noma. I appreciate it.